Typically, at the beginning of each episode, when I'm speaking to a mom, I ask them what their transition into motherhood was like.
Whew, that's a tough question.
It's a big one.
Yeah, it's a big one. Really traumatic. I mean, I think there's now terms for like post-traumatic stress or traumatic birth, but there was nothing, Renee, that panned out the way I was supposed to, that it was supposed to. And it started with having anaphylactic shock to the epidural after being induced of 48 hours. So having my son an early Sunday morning when I'd been in the hospital since the Thursday, and being in anaphylactic shock, having to be strapped down, not knowing how my son was going to get out because I was only dilated 1 centimeter, but also I couldn't have a C-section because the anesthesia wasn't working. So it was a really, really hard time. And this is when we just had Blackberries. We didn't have iPhones.
Right.
This is 2008. And so my husband was like Googling all of these reactions to morphine and epidurals. And it was just a complete and total disaster. And that, to me, it's so upsetting because it didn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
It really didn't. I feel like the American medical system, your OBGYN is on call for maybe like 10 hours. So by Sunday, I had somebody who was completely unfamiliar. I'd never met them before, who was helping me deliver the baby, helping me make medical decisions, not being informed, feeling completely and totally helpless. And yeah, that was, and then of course, having the hardest time breastfeeding after something like that and feeling like I had to because I was still in pre-fair play where a lot of guilt and shame was directing my parenting and my motherhood.
I'm always curious about people that have very traumatic birthing experiences. Was there anything put in place to help you or support you after the fact?
Never, nothing. We were in a hospital in New York City. There wasn't even, a transportation service to get out of there. So, what they expect you to do is just stand on the curb and hail a cab. I mean, this was before Uber. At that point, Seth and I didn't have, say like extra cash to maybe hire $1,000, wait for you car service.
Mm-hmm.
So we literally, we hailed a cab home with our newborn.
And so with regard to help like trying to process the trauma, like I have a friend that had a really traumatic, and she had twins and they were in the ICU for like a month or something, and but different ICUs, so she had to go back and forth. She was trying to breastfeed and pump, and there was no like, hey, like how are you doing, like speaking to a counselor or anything.
Nothing, zero, literally nothing. The only thing we saw was a company trying to pitch us to bank our cord blood. And then I had, maybe on my nightstand, what to expect when you're expecting, a book that told me my child was the size of a watermelon. But Renee, especially in 2008, when you can, there wasn't no podcasts, there was no apps,
social media.
There was no social media. So you felt really, really alone. There were baby groups, but I didn't feel like I had, the capacity to really join a baby group. I tried to join one, but the only one was across town. And again, I had my oldest son in Manhattan in New York. And so to get there, it was either like trekking 3 miles or 2.5 miles through the snow or rain, or again, trying to hail a cab. But unfortunately, cabs then really, they probably are today too. I mean, I guess now there's Uber, it's different, but they wouldn't stop if they saw you had a baby carriage or a car seat. So it was pretty isolating. And I think that isolation was the beginning of a really hard time of postpartum anxiety for me, where then I think because I didn't process some of the trauma of how hard it was to give birth, and Seth didn't have any paternity leave, so he went back to work within 7 days, being isolated and alone and not having family support. I think everyone also assumes that somehow your parents are going to be there for you, but I don't know. My father is not actively involved in my life. My mother was still a professor of social change and social work. She was working full time. So sort of just being alone, in this daze and fog, trying to heal yourself while also caring for a newborn. It sort of, I think it triggered postpartum anxiety for me that I didn't understand the link for before, but I couldn't, let Zach go more than 2 minutes without checking on his stomach to make sure he was breathing. And then we want to hear the funny, I never bring this up, but I just had this memory that I had that maybe I suppressed. There was a woman in my building. So back to being isolated. And I was so happy because she had older kids. And I kept thinking, I can't believe her kids are older. How do you get through every day to get them to be older? She came up to me and she looked at Zach, who was in his car seat. And, you click it onto that Graco thing where you take around. And she looked at Zach and said, oh my God, what a beautiful baby. That was the age where my son died. And I was like, excuse me? And she was like, yeah, the bench you're sitting on across the street from our building is named after my son. It's we named the bench after him because he died of SIDS. And I never even knew what SIDS was. And then we did have the internet back then in 2008. Right. And so then I became obsessively checking the internet for what SIDS was. And it put me down like a terrible spiral. But again, no access to SSRIs. I never even thought of taking like a Zoloft or Lexapro. No screening, nothing, zero.
Yeah. And I feel like even nowadays, doctors are more well-versed. Like, I guess everybody is because people are talking about it now. And I remember I had really bad anxiety, but only for the first 2 weeks after Milo was born. But it was like clockwork. Yeah. 7, as soon as the sun would start to go down, bawling my eyes out. It felt like the world was ending, but nobody around me knew that the world was ending. Right, it was only me.
Yes.
And I would just hysterically cry. And my husband's like watching Jeopardy. Milo's like sleeping calmly in his thing. And I remember telling my family doctor that, and she had young kids at home. And she was like, what you're experiencing is very, very common. Like when the sun goes down, it's very nerve-wracking.
Yes, because you have no control over what's going to happen that night.
It's quiet. Nobody's around. Yes. Like the days are kind of busy. And she told me, she's like, if it doesn't go away in a couple weeks, like come back and we'll help you. Like but even just her acknowledging that like this is very common and like you're not going like Looney Tunes was nice. But I'm sure back then there wasn't much of a conversation about it.
No, there really wasn't. I mean, maybe in other places outside of the big cities, maybe there was more access to doulas or different types of support. But, New York City is a factory. It's a machine. People, it's very impersonal anyway. It's hard to do anything there in New York. But it was especially hard to start that process. And I think another thing I remember of that time, because again, Seth had gone back to work, and this is 3 years before sort of I had any realizations around what fair play would become. But I think what was so hard was I had no assumption that Seth would take paternity leave or that he would stay home. He was running a company. So the idea that he wouldn't go back to work felt so foreign, but I worked for a major corporation. So I did get maternity leave. And so, of course, you start to end up in these patterns where, people and women especially think that somehow we're wired differently for care or that we're better multitaskers. We say these things to ourselves that help us become complicit in our own oppression. But at the time, they're the only things we can say to ourselves to rationalize the pain and the fear and the isolation of doing this alone. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's what's happened to especially American parents. But, I see this happening in 17 industrialized nations that I interviewed women and men and all genders, that there isn't a understanding of the mental toll that having to take care of another person, what that mental toll is. And so then when one person holds the mental toll, it becomes even harder to transfer that mental toll on anybody else. And so then we have to start saying things to ourselves to make ourselves feel better. But when we do that, well, Seth has to go to work. He makes more money than me. My job is more flexible. In the time it would take me to tell Seth what to do, I should do it myself. I'm a better multitasker. I'm wired differently for care. Those are all messages that women start to say to themselves to rationalize this pain and isolation. But ultimately what it does, it just makes us in a cycle of unfairness that continues every single generation. And so that's basically what I'm trying to break. But at that time, I just knew that I was entering this cycle, but it felt like quicksand. So it was almost like I didn't know what to do. I had no vocabulary for it. And so I ended up rationalizing using all those messages I just told you.
So in your motherhood journey, obviously, I'm sure everybody listening knows the book Fair Play. I talk about it all the time. Like, I swear, every time I'm doing a TikTok of like being the default parent or something, like I have the book.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But by the way, you are a cultural warrior for doing this. This is a movement.
Thank you.
And I just want to say that, this is not about selling books. We have all of our content now on our website. We're trying to get this out. This is a movement. And so when you can use those words and be out there on TikTok, in a way that, I'm not, but I need you, I need you to similar to how that doctor normalized for you that, it felt normal to cry at 7. When you can normalize to people that it doesn't have to be that way, that, being the default parent is hard, and that there are ways to talk about it. So it's not just you ending up, as so many women have told me, overwhelmed and bored.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. So thank you, Renee.
How old where in your motherhood journey were you like, wait a minute, like this shit's not right. Like I want to, like, when did all of that happen?
Well, since you got, we got to tell stories that I've never told before about sort of New York. The first thing, Renee, that I thought, again, because I didn't have you, I didn't have somebody tell me anything about any default parent, was the weather. So again, I had no vernacular to understand why I hated Seth so much or why I felt so frustrated, and so I just assumed it was the weather. So then Seth and I got into this vernacular of, well, things will just be better in the spring because Zach was born in September, and then we went into a very cold winter. And so by spring, things weren't necessarily getting better in terms of my feelings for my husband. And then I figured, well, it's because we live in a place where it's going to be winter again. And so then we actually moved to Los Angeles when Zach was 15 months old. And then somehow I thought everything was going to be perfect because we were living in warm weather.
Sunshine.
So then things weren't. And then I had my second son, and I figured, well, that's when things are going to feel much better because there's no way that Seth can assume that I'm responsible for 2 children. Like I thought maybe the unfairness in our marriage, it was sort of like bubbling in the back of my mind, was because we had 1 child. So of course he should take the leisure time because, he has a harder job or he has to wake up earlier or his medical care, his, working out should take precedence over mine. Again, not sure where that came from, but that was the sort of the gendered assumptions I think I was falling into, even though Seth was a feminist man and we had a very equal relationship before kids. I think that's the hardest part. Even if I had known that even the best of men do 5 to 15 hours a week less after children come. They do 5 to 15 hours a week less childcare and housework. If I even knew that that was sort of what happens, that traditional gender roles start to seep in, even to the most equal marriages, then I would have felt better because I would have said, oh, this happens to everybody. We can fix it. But I felt such shame that I thought I had married this very feminist man, and then our relationship was basically going to shit. So after my second son was born, and I write about this in Fair Play, Seth sends me a text, and you know this, but I'll tell us just for the listeners who don't. He sends me a text that says, I'm surprised you didn't get blueberries. So I want you to will help for the listeners conjure what that scene was. So I'm getting this text, I'm surprised you didn't get blueberries. But it was in the context of wherever he was, maybe he'd been home early or working from home. I don't know why he was in our house trying to make a smoothie at that time. But I was also picking up at that time my son from his Zach, the one I was telling you about, was born in New York, from his toddler transition program. In America, those programs last like 15 minutes. You have to pay $1 million for them. We have no universal childcare, any subsidized childcare. So I was running to pick him up from this program that lasted like a minute. I had a breast pump and a diaper bag in the passenger seat of the car. I remember having gifts. I still remember the store. It had like an orange bag. Gifts for Ben, my newborn baby who had just been born, in the back seat of the car. He was about like 3 months at the time, maybe 4 months. And in fact, I also had a client contract in my lap. So I would mark up things analog. So I remember I had the pen in between my legs and sort of the stop sign, the pen would back up into my vagina. So I sort of had this like pen stabbing me in the vagina. So I was being like stabbed in the vagina by a pen. I had all this chaos in the car. I'm still trying to, keep the day moving, not be late to pick up Zach. And then Seth sends me this fucking text, about blueberries. And I was like, I don't even what are you talking about? And so I pulled over, which we're here in LA. So, we don't do that lightly here because there's a lot of traffic. I pulled over. I knew I was going to still probably be late to pick up Zach, but I started to sob. Like that 7 p.m. cry, like one of those like really intense, like I can't do this anymore. I'm not going to live like this anymore. And that was the day where I felt that being the fulfiller of my husband's smoothie needs, like the assumption that I would be the fulfiller of his smoothie needs, was no longer how I was going to live my life. I didn't know what was going to happen after that day, but I knew that that was the end of how I had been living up to that point.
Oh, I love when there's like a clear moment.
It was a very
where
clear moment.
There was a pen.
Yes.
And I remember.
Yes, I remember that pen in my vagina saying, this is not. And look, I'll just give you context, right? Obviously, people will say, well, whoa, this person's like completely out of her mind. And, it's just a request for,
No,
a grocery, right? Right. It's that. But of course, it's the buildup of these unfair assumptions that women shoulder. And I think the other things that made it feel so painful was the straw that broke the camel's back, RENEE, for me, was that I'd already been abandoned by 2 places, meaning my workplace had already abandoned me. The reason I had the client contract in my lap was because I had started my own law firm at the time, because I had this myth that, working for myself would be easier and more flexible, and, all those things we tell ourselves, and we lose our health insurance and our 401k. And then we end up in maybe worse power positions with a partner, because then we're more reliant on their income because our job is more flexible, but then we're doing more unpaid labor. So it was sort of that cycle I was already getting into. And the reason why I had to quit my job, or now I say forced out, was because, this corporate company was doing bad things to me.
Mm-hmm.
They were telling me I couldn't have direct reports anymore. They were saying that basically I'm on probation just because I had a child, like somehow I'd done something bad, which felt like highly shaming and sad. Of course, I did work for a woman, but she chose not to have children. So it was, you made a choice, that weird, like you made a choice vernacular around parenting, even though we need children to like fund our Social Security, continue the world. Yeah, but it was my choice.
Yeah.
And then, people panic when they say our birth rates are going down. So it was this really sad ending of my career in the corporate world. And then on top of it, that toddler transition program I was telling you about that I was running to pick up Zach from was a place where people told me I'd find solace and friendship. And I remember going there and saying, wow, I'm finally going to school in America. Once your kids are in school, I hear it's easier. And walking into that school environment where the teacher was introducing us to each other, is telling us we were going to have this amazing friendship with all the people around us, and they were going to know us better than anyone's ever known us. They were going to support us during like all of our parenting milestones. And then looking down at the table when I put my name tag on, and it said Zach's mom. So I was also abandoned by that community because they didn't even care to know my name.
Yeah.
So I think it was that trifecta. It was the feeling that all of a sudden I'm a role to the school. I don't even get my own name. Now you can see I wear my own initial around my neck always to remind myself I have a name, not my children's, mine. This school environment abandoning me, the work environment abandoning me, and then on top of it, finally realizing, wow, Seth is not engaged in this. And at that time, the statistic, and still it's dire, women shoulder 2/3 or more of what it takes to run a home and family. regardless of whether we work outside the home. And as we gain more economic power, it gets worse. That's how we know it's a gender issue. So I think that was a statistic I was undeniably living, RENEE, but I didn't know it at the time.
Do you, like, when you tell that blueberry story, I'm picturing you making a TikTok, telling that story, and the feedback that you would get on that TikTok, because I had a similar TikTok that went viral, and it was literally just me in the moment being like, my husband was on his way out the door, and he's like, oh, I'm going to go to Walmart today. Do we need anything? And I was like, you shut your mouth right now.
Yes.
And like, we laugh about it now. And he prepares me. It's like an ongoing joke. He's like, hey, listen, I'm going to ask you something right now. Okay. But I want you to, like, it's not like we can go to Walmart another day. Because when someone asks you that as they're leaving out the door, in my mind, I panic and I'm like, this is the only time we can go to Walmart. Like, I need to scan.
I need diapers. I need
house.
formula. Yeah.
You're panicking. And so I was like, don't ask me that question. And so I made a TikTok about that. And then in the comments, of course, well, a majority of women are like, oh my God, yes. But then you always get people that are like, oh my God, her poor husband. And I'm like, he's fine.
Yeah.
Like, he's fine. This, like, it's these little nuanced situations that when you actually bring light to them, so many people are like, wow, that's so relatable. Like in quarantine, I used to get so angry when my husband would make pancakes in the morning on the weekend. I was like, excuse me? Like, no.
Are you going to leave all this shit to leave out?
Yeah.
And you're wasting flour.
Even if he did clean up, though, I was like, I've been watching Milo like a hawk all week because he was at that young age. And my husband is a physician, so he was working outside the home during quarantine.
Yes.
I'm like, Saturday, I'm like, finally, you're home. Like, I can have a coffee without like having to watch Milo. And then he goes in the kitchen and starts making pancakes. I was like, excuse me? Like, he can have toast.
Yeah. And
he can have toast.
And watch your kid. Yeah.
But then the feedback is always like, her poor husband, he just wanted to make breakfast for his family. And like, so what do you say to comments like that? And especially comments where it's like, he works outside the home. He provides, a lot of the time I get this, like, he provides for the family financially. So I do all the childcare and the home tasks. That's not fair.
No, you can't. Okay, so let's break down two of those things. Both of those things that just happened to you or that you hear are because we live in a capitalist patriarchy. And that's not because I'm liberal, conservative. That's just the facts of what our society is. So patriarchy is when men's needs come first. And so typically in a patriarchy, what you'll see is that even women, again, we become complicit in our own oppression. Women get on board that men's needs come first too. That's what happens in a patriarchy. And what that also means is that men's time comes first. So we treat men's time as if it's diamonds, like it's finite. We guard that really well. And then we treat women's time as if it's infinite, like sand. And we do that on purpose. The reason why we have to do that on purpose is because when you can treat somebody's time like sand and basically say, I can find the time, then one party, so the non-patriarchal party, the women, half of our population, their time gets dictated for them, what they have to do. Whereas men get to retain economic power and leisure time. So you basically all have to just ask, is this a comment that helps society maintain men's economic power and leisure time? So when you say things like, I get the privilege to do everything at home where he goes out and provides for us, it's actually the opposite. You're the one taking the economic risk. Because if that person wants to leave that relationship, they're leaving with skills and they're leaving with money. And you have no power, and especially in America, our family law system, I'm a lawyer, is really rigged against women and especially unpaid labor. And I'm trying to change that. So that's something, stay tuned, everybody. As RENEE here works hopefully with the TikTok audience and changes relationship by relationship, I'm out there trying to fight for federal and state policies to change some of these things. So what am I talking about? Well, for example, if you've ever seen a health system, we still in America, I'm not sure about Canada, say things to women like breastfeeding is free. when it's 1,800 hours a year, right?
Yeah.
That's a typical patriarchal
Time is money.
right? So shows how we gaslight women to believe their time is infinite and sand. We if you see women enter male professions, what happens is salaries automatically come down. So basically, we've convinced women since birth that their time is less valuable. So then what happens then is that we have to say things, as I said earlier, to ourselves to put things in place. The number one thing that I heard in the Fair Play journey for why women didn't want to come to the table was, how can I ask for help with unpaid labor, with childcare and housework? That's my job. My partner makes my life. So I like to reverse it and say, actually, no, you make their life, you know? And again, this doesn't have to just be men and women, but I center that dynamic because of the patriarchy. You make their life. And you're the one taking the economic risk. And I know that because I interviewed thousands of women in their 50s and 60s and 70s who are at the other end of that economic risk. And I know what happens to women. And so we also know that relationships are better when men do more childcare and housework. So if you want to stay in that relationship, if you're going to take that economic risk, it's better to probably stay in that relationship. God forbid it's not abusive. Then you want to invite men in to their full power. Also, childcare and housework, which is ultimately what fair play is. Fair play is a metaphor, as you know, RENEE. It's 100 cards, and those 100 cards represent everything it takes to run a home and a household. You play with 60 cards if you don't have children. You add 40 cards if you have kids. So let's just marinate on that. You're adding almost twice the work, and nobody even acknowledges that. We just have the baby, and we think we're going to use 3 toxic words. We're going to figure it out, which nobody does. So you have these 100 cards. There is no actual way that one person can handle that all. We've lived in communal spaces for forever and until nuclear families. Human beings were never, ever, ever, ever designed to have a woman and a baby without communal support. It just doesn't happen. And actually, men were very supportive until basically the Industrial Revolution. Homes worked more like small businesses. People were in and out. Childcare was done by everybody around the small business and the farming communities. It definitely seems like it was like that when we had the more agrarian societies. But since World War II and the move to suburbia, we sort of pushed people into these nuclear family configurations where a woman is isolated in the home and men go out into the world. That's where we got the term stay-at-home mom. So all these things I'm talking about are just basically constructs of a capitalist patriarchy. And then you add on top of the fact that in a capitalist society, we view money as the most important way to measure time. And so if you believe time is money, then of course you're going to view paid labor as more important as unpaid labor.
Oh, see, I view time as like
that's
valuable as money.
That's what it should be.
Yeah. That's what I always say. I'm like, no, time, because if I want to pay for whatever it is, like a quicker something to be faster, I'm like, yeah, but that's saving time. Like time is so valuable. But you're right in that. And a thing about like my husband provides financially and I do the childcare and the home care.
Yeah, I have like a panic attack even when you say it like that. Yes.
Yeah, because I get comments like that all the time when it's like default parent content. And it'll be like, yeah, but he's the default provider. And I'm like, yeah, but like his job, because there's always the argument of like, he comes home from work, he needs to decompress. I'm like, well, what about you? Like, do you get to decompress? Because technically, like based on research, your job with little kids at home is more stressful than his desk job.
It is.
You know, like when do you get to decompress? The stay-at-home mom taking care of young kids, taking care of the home is never ending. So you're working 24/7 and they're what, going to work for 8 hours?
But it's also, remember you're working 24/7 for no money. For no money.
Yeah.
So your partner is working 8 hours, 10 hours, even if it's 15 hours a day for pay, for money. Right. And so that's where I get worried about women who make that calculation because that silo it doesn't work. The only way it works is if there's some other coercive force. So what do I mean by that? Well, I've been studying unpaid labor now for 10 years. So if there's another coercive force, it can work. And the coercive force that could work is similar to what you just said earlier, which is to come full circle in those two comments. So the comment we were addressing is my partner makes more money than me, so I should do all the unpaid labor. But the other thing you just were talking about that I think is important to come full circle on is that shame. Do not talk about your partner. I feel so bad for him that, he just wants to make pancakes for his family, right? So that is the nail in the coffin that traps women underground.
Mm-hmm.
Because what happens now is that you have a experience where, again, that person from the capitalist and patriarchal side has more leisure time and holds power because they have money. They have access to money. They have access to skills. They can leave and walk out the door tomorrow and still be able to support themselves. Where women end up in a situation where we have flexible jobs, quote unquote. We may be working for ourselves. So we've lost health insurance. We've lost access to 401k planning. We have a lot harder time exiting that relationship. And then on top of that, we are now told that we should be grateful because he just wants to make you pancakes. So we're not even allowed to bring up what's happening to us. And that is sort of what happened to me at the beginning of my should I do spreadsheet journey. So fair play cards, the 100 cards didn't just come out of, the air. They came, RENEE, over 10 years of refining a question around what do women do that may be invisible to their partner that takes more than 2 minutes. I started to ask women like you. I would have asked on TikTok for sure if I had it back then. But back then it was called the snowball research effect because it was like early Facebook. So I had to get to people to answer these questions. But finally, after a year, and this was right after the blueberries breakdown, you asked me what happened after that. The real catalyst for me was to understand what was happening to me. That was, I felt, the most important thing. I needed to understand what was happening to me. Hard to understand what's happening to you if you're not allowed to criticize your partner. Mm-hmm. So in private, without, telling my mother-in-law or friends that I was really, really unhappy in my marriage, I went to the library and I started to find articles called The Second Shift, Emotional Labor, Wages for Housework. And I literally started crying that there were feminists in the past, RENEE, that had been doing this work in, a vacuum because I'd never heard of it. And I consider myself a pretty well-read feminist. I mean, I'm a lawyer who was educated at Harvard and I don't know these things. Mm-hmm. So how can we expect anybody to know these things if they don't, It was really, really very, very liberating to understand that this is like the same shit, different decade, that I wasn't alone. And so from there, again, I was able to say, oh, this thing has a name. And once I could name it, I felt I could tame it. I don't know, that's probably one of those like shirts, like a slogan on a shirt. But it was this idea that I'm an organizational management lawyer by training. And one of our sort of gurus in the field, his name is Peter Drucker. And his famous quote is, you can't manage what you don't measure. And so for me, this idea that maybe I could start changing my life if I could give women the vernacular to understand that holding cards, nobody should hold a full deck. I like that metaphor. I also like the idea that it could be a game that doesn't have to be so shameful and painful that, oh, there's a game. There's us against the cards. How are we going to divide up this labor? It doesn't have to feel an assumption or gendered. But it started with an understanding that there have been women before us who have called this the second shift, emotional labor, unpaid labor, and invisible work. And so that was sort of the beginning for me. Was I felt that if I could make the invisible visible, I could make things better for women. But it started with me having to tell my own story. And that's exactly what you said earlier. If you're going to listen to those comments, like, I feel so bad for Seth. How's he married to somebody who's willing to air their dirty laundry? Then unfortunately, we're going to be in these cycles forever.
But what's interesting about those comments is it's great because my husband and I can talk about it and he gets a kick out of it. Like, we have a great relationship. And if I can't be like, hey, listen, I don't want you to make pancakes. Like, this is what I want. Like, what kind of relationship is that? And I always like to point out whenever I talk about default parent things or these like nuanced situations that we have worked through and talked about, I like to point out that it's not my husband's fault.
No.
He didn't wake up that day and be like, fuck her.
Yeah.
I'm going to go make
Yeah,
pancakes.
yes.
He literally, like on paper, the things that he would do look great. Like, oh, wow, he wakes up, he makes pancakes, he does the laundry. But at that moment in our life in quarantine, which was very difficult, I didn't want him to go do laundry. I wanted to be able to go for a walk and, you know, like I just wanted him to take
You want him to
Milo.
hold the watching card.
Yes, take
The watching
Milo.
card is the card that nobody wants.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to be honest.
Because you can't get anything done.
No, it's a horrible card.
Yeah.
And the watching card is one of the 100 fair play cards. And it is what it sounds like. It is watching of children. And you cannot, and it's a card, it's its own card because you cannot do anything else. And also it includes other things. The reason why people hate that card is because it includes playing, which people hate to do.
The worst.
It includes preparing for a snack or a meal if it's during that meal time. It includes changing diapers if they're young. It includes making sure they don't harm themselves. It's a highly stressful card. So typically what we see is that people would rather schedule a root canal than watch a toddler or baby, right? That's an actual study.
You know,
root canals.
This reminds me of the
are
comments.
better, yes.
The comments that I would get on some of these TikToks are like, you know, from men that have physical labor jobs, and they would be like, "Oh no, you have to watch your kid at home in pajamas. Like, try digging a ditch for 12 hours."
Right,
I'm like,
right.
honestly, can I listen to a podcast while I'm
Like
digging
doing
the
my
ditch?
I'm
Like,
digging the ditch.
Can I think my own thoughts? Because sign me up.
Sign me up. Sign me up for being in a root canal chair. Are you kidding? I get to sleep.
Yeah.
I mean, who cares if there's a drill in my mouth?
Dentists
you know?
now have TVs.
Yeah,
like-
it's the best hour ever. And we know that. We know that watching children is really low on the scale of what people like to do because it's really, really terrible. It's really terrible. And sometimes I'll just be done, like, you know, watching my kids for an hour and just like slam the table because it's so, if you haven't done it, right, it's so hard to articulate just like, but I will say I did have a word cloud where I sort of surveyed women about unpaid labor. And as I said earlier, 2 words came to the top, which I thought was so beautiful because it actually really encapsulated that feeling of, you know, root canal versus watching, is that the 2 top words when you're home doing domestic labor is overwhelm and boredom together.
Mm-hmm.
I think when you're overwhelmed, you think, oh my God, I'm busy. I have a big career. When you're bored, you're a teenager and you're like, I'm bored. I can just go to the mall. No, when you're overwhelmed and bored, that's a terrible combination. And typically people will do everything in their power to get out of it. So exactly, like I want to make the pancakes, you watch the toddler. I'll go do the laundry, you watch the toddler. Can I go grocery shopping? Like you watch the toddler. Because it's so hard. That watching card is so hard. So I think, yes, in theory, it's hard to understand what we're talking about, but in the context of a pandemic and what you were saying, absolutely, I totally identify with your partner. I would be doing laundry all day and making the pancakes. I do not like watching toddlers.
I started cutting the grass
Right,
in
yes.
quarantine. I was like, oh, no, you're not. Like, you've been at work talking to adults, like doing your regular life all week.
I love it.
Like, I will cut the grass and listen to a podcast. Like,
You take care of the baby. Yeah.
totally. And then, but also there's the shame with that because
Yes,
now I'm
yes.
putting out all this content saying, I don't want to watch my kid.
100%.
And people are like,
Absolutely.
you said what? And I'm like, yeah, I need a break from the job that I've been doing all week. Like, I'm going to go cut the grass, you know? And then you get the shaming comments.
So let's talk
about
about guilt
that.
and shame for a minute, because I think that's really important because it's come up now, right, in these comments a couple of times. So this is really important, I think, in terms of the fair play conversations. There is a secret formula. So let's just say that. The good news about what we're saying is that we found a secret formula, and especially because we were able to interview basically thousands of couples in the pandemic for a documentary we were doing. That's on Hulu if you ever want to see it. But it was really interesting because we got to see Fair Play had just come out. The book and the system had come out in 2019. About 3 months. It was in October. So yes. So that would be November, December. Yeah. Basically like 4 months before the lockdowns or 5 months before it started. So we were able to see people who had, and we had beta testers from before that. So people who were going into the quarantine with a fair play mindset versus those who didn't. And we found that, yes, of course, again, this is in the context of we would love, especially in America, better paid leave and, paternity leave and childcare options, right? That's a given. But just because the air is polluted doesn't mean you don't breathe. So individual solutions matter and fair play matters. And it matters because we saw that people who had a practice of three things, it was making a very big difference in their lives. And those three things, the secret formula, were boundaries, systems, and communication. So the system I just told you is this idea of the card game. You own tasks based on, the day, the month, the year, and you own them with full ownership. You go to the grocery store. It's not like, hey, give me a list from Walmart. It's, I know what my family needs at Walmart because I've gotten stakeholder buy-in from the family. I know what we typically eat. I've looked at our meal plan, and I'm going with full ownership to the store. So there's 100 cards you can take ownership of. That's the system. And we'll talk about communication. But you just brought up shame and guilt and what people can do to us. That's boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't have boundaries if you don't also believe your time is diamonds. The thing we talked about, because that's the patriarchal conditioning of women. How do you believe your time is diamonds? One of the ways that you won't do that is if you act on guilt and shame. So what we found for women was that it wasn't just the system. I couldn't just hand people the cards and say, just do like work does. Do it like my Aunt Marion's Mahjong group, where you don't bring snack twice to the group, RENEE, and you're out. Like, just use ownership. It happens everywhere else. Like, don't do this. I want to help you. Like, own things like you would in any work situation. It didn't work because women were unfortunately conditioned in this patriarchy. And so what happened was that even if, again, I'm talking women, men now, where men wanted to step into their full power in the home, guilt and shame stopped a lot of women from allowing that to happen. And again, I'm not blaming women at all. It's just how we get conditioned. So let's talk about how guilt and shame breaches our boundaries. There was a woman, a single mom, who reached out to me in the pandemic. She had read my second book, and she was so excited because she was going back to piano. She lives in this rent-stabilized apartment in New York City where there's a Juilliard school there. So there's a piano room. So she tells me that she booked 4:00 every Tuesday to play piano. She got sheet music. She was going to go play like Rent, like Beauty and the Beast, all of her favorite, like Disney musicals. She said that when she got into the seat to start playing, she noticed the sun was setting. So it sets early in New York City in the winter. And she started having a guilt and shame that her toddler does not like to be in daycare when it's dark out. And so she told me she just left. She left the sheet music and went to pick him up. Other emotions don't do that for us. Anger, happiness, fear, we will feel them. Guilt and shame actually make us act right in the moment in ways that is not beneficial to our long-term success. So what can I tell you about guilt and shame? Dr. Becky and I love to talk about this together. Guilt is only when you do something that's out of alignment with your values. So let's talk about that woman playing piano. She said she felt guilty versus real guilt. Real guilt, RENEE, would be you're running back to the airport to go back to Toronto, and you yell at your cab driver because you're running late and he's going slow on the freeway. You can feel guilty after that because yelling at somebody who's trying to help you is out of alignment with your values. You're not allowed to feel guilty because you're playing piano, because that's in alignment with your values. Playing piano, bringing beauty and music to the world is part of your values. It was part of that woman's values. So what is she feeling instead? What she's doing is what we women do in a patriarchal system, which is that we anticipate other people's discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of feeling guilty, what she was really feeling was the discomfort of her child, the discomfort of the daycare, and the shame of coming late, even though they knew she could have picked up earlier. That is not guilt. So if we can realize that we shouldn't be feeling guilt and shame, that we can throw that, as Dr. Becky says, throw that tennis ball into the other court of the other person, whether it's your child, whether it's your partner, whether it's your community, whether it's your workplace, and you can hold that boundary firm, then we're going to do a lot better. And that's why, again, fair play is a movement towards boundaries. Your time is diamonds. You deserve a permission to be unavailable from your roles. It's that system. And it's also, of course, communicating and asking for what you need.
I feel like the title of this episode should be Your Time is Diamonds.
Your Time is Diamonds.
Because I love it.
I love it. Yes.
Okay, this was an amazing conversation. I'm so happy that we made it happen in person too.
In person.
Yeah. So it was lovely to meet you. And if you guys forgot, if you listen back into the intro, we have a giveaway that we're going to have on social media. So you'll have to leave a comment, or I'll share the instructions in the caption. So be sure to enter the giveaway. And where can people find you online? Where should we direct them to?
All tools, if you're interested in, again, the boundaries, the systems, or the communication tools, Fair Play Life. And you can sign up for our newsletter. We have a lot of stuff around how you can become a cultural warrior if you're looking to do more activism around these things. And also, of course, Fair Play Life is our Instagram handle.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, RENEE.
And I'm on a roll.